Welcome to the Marquis Masters Podcast. I'm Ryan Estes. What if one of the biggest threats to children's health wasn't visible, wasn't talked about, and was literally beneath our feet, while powerful industries fought to keep it that way? Today's guest helped uncover that truth. I'm joined by Walter Mielke, Adjunct Research Professor at the Tulane University School of Medicine, whose research linked lead in urban soil to childhood brain damage and helped trigger the global phase-out of leaded gasoline. We're talking cities, cars, soil, blood, policy, and one scientist's data going up against billion-dollar industries. In this conversation, you'll learn how lead actually accumulated in cities, why children were the most affected, and how science reshaped public policy at scale, and what lessons today's researchers and changemakers can learn about courage, persistence, and truth. If you care about science, public health, environmental justice, or how real change actually happens, this episode is for you. For more stories like this, go explore the legacy makers at marquiswhoswho.com. That's marquiswhoswho.com, where impact gets its receipts. And if this episode sparks something for you, leave us a review. Think of it as tipping the scientist who changed the world. And now my conversation with Walter Mielke. Welcome to the Marquis Masters Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Yes, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you a little bit through my research, and I just can't wait to talk to you. Now, I'm going to dive right in here. So, you are famous for pioneering research linking soil lead contamination to children's health and influencing the global phase-out of leaded gasoline. What an absolutely staggering accomplishment. So, walk us through how you began this research and then tell us the story.
Well, I think the real story starts with finding the instrumentation that it needs to be used. I ended up working, first of all, with the atomic absorption spectrometer, and that is an instrument that provided the ability to measure small amounts of lead. And I worked with the U.S. Department of Agriculture outside of Baltimore, and we put together a program, a scheme to be able to measure the amount of lead in soil. The U.S. Department of Agriculture was using a method that was not effective, and I also happened to be working with NASA. And so I kind of joined together the idea of imaging and measuring the amount of lead in soil. And then as a teacher, I had an assignment to bring my students in. They became involved in the studies because they actually collected samples from gardens within their own environment outside of Baltimore. I was at UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And that connection suddenly became the possibility of looking at an entire metropolitan area, both within the interior of the city and outlying areas of the city. And so we collected soils as a group, and students were involved. And then I measured the amount of lead in the soil from gardens across the entire city of Baltimore. And I did this work when I was in Baltimore, but my tenure was over at the UMBC, and I moved to Macalester College in Minnesota. And I brought the sample results with me, and I happened to have a brother who was a statistician. He's passed, but he was really interested in the spatial dynamics of the soil within an urban environment. And what he discovered was that the amount of lead in the soil was connected with the location within the city, that the interior of the city had very high lead levels in the soil. And this was in Baltimore, where the interior buildings are brick and stucco or stone, and the outline area tend to be old housing that was painted. And the expectation was that the painted buildings were the place where the soil would be high in lead, but it turns out that the opposite was the case. It was the interior of the city. And the difference between the interior of the city and the outlying areas of the city was so large that it established the idea that lead was accumulating in the city in a different way than was normally expected. It's not just a paint problem, but it's more than that. And it turns out the amount of lead in gasoline accounted for that difference. And when I moved to Minnesota, I decided that it was important to replicate the studies in Baltimore. And so I did that with, again, classroom of students working with me to get samples. And it's always students were involved in this. And we mapped out the city of St. Paul and Minneapolis. And in both cities, we saw exactly the same pattern. The interior of the city was very highly contaminated with lead, and outlying areas were very, very low in lead. And that's true for both St. Paul and Minneapolis. And then my students, we decided to look at small cities and large cities. And from this work, we realized that small cities had very small amounts of lead, and large cities had larger amounts of lead. The more interior the samples came from, the higher the lead levels. And when I worked with the state of Minnesota, a program was put together by the legislature to measure the amount of lead in soil and the blood lead levels of children that are living in the same communities as the soil was being collected. And what we saw was that there was a very strong association between the amount of lead in the soil and the blood lead of the children. And that turns out to be true every city I've ever looked at. That's a long answer.
Fascinating. Yeah. No, and I want to dig in here. So, the assumption that lead paint, and we all heard about that, growing up, don't eat the paint, but as you really kind of like dug in, using kind of high precision, safe methods to measure environmental lead, what started to point the finger towards leaded gasoline? Was that something you kind of had a suspicion of, or kind of what was the light bulb moment when you're like, hey, it could be the gasoline, largely because, in larger cities you have a more concentration of cars?
Well, um, I before I moved to Baltimore, I was a professor at UCLA in the Department of Geography. And when I moved into Los Angeles, the first thing I recognized was that the air was different. And there was something really different about the city of Los Angeles. And I had students at UCLA who were coming to class every day, and I got information from the students about their journey to work, the amount of miles that they drove to come to class every day. And so I collected that information, and what I discovered was that there was an enormous amount of gasoline being consumed, and I knew how much lead was in gasoline. So I was able to calculate the tonnages of lead that were being introduced into the environment, into the air, as a result of travel taking place in Los Angeles. And that was a very strong signal to me that travel, just driving, was creating a problem. And there was some other research that was done by a person by the name of Claire Patterson, and he did work on the amount of lead showing up in glaciers within Antarctica and in the Arctic. And what he saw was that the older the ice was working from the top down, the smaller the amount of lead was in the ice. So the ice had very small amounts of lead deeper into the ice and very large amounts of lead toward the surface. And that was a very important finding, and it was part of his realization that maybe cities got contaminated, but he never did the research on cities. And that's what I picked up on and did research on the accumulation of lead within the soils within urban environments.
Have you ever wondered how some people's stories live on, not just through their work, but through history itself? For nearly 130 years, Marquis Who's Who has been documenting the lives of leaders, innovators, and changemakers across every profession. From CEOs and scientists to artists and educators, Marquis has captured the stories behind success, the people who define our times. Being listed in Marquis Who's Who isn't just recognition, it's taking control of your personal brand and using it to create a meaningful and impactful legacy. It's a record of your life's work, preserved, published, and accessible to generations who will study, research, and be inspired by your contribution. If you've built something meaningful and you've made an impact in your field or community, this is how you ensure your story is told and your personal brand is maintained accurately with integrity. Visit MarquisWho'sWho.com to learn more about how you or someone you admire can be featured, because history remembers those who take the time to record it. Incredible. And there's kind of two things happening here that are really important. One, demonstrating that urban soils contain far higher lead levels than rural areas, but also linking that the lead in the soil is a direct corollary to children's exposure and health outcomes, which is also a very important link. Now, were the kids' elevated levels of lead coming from the soil, or was it rather the lead that was entering the soil was entering children in the same way?
Well, it's really both.
Yeah.
Children were just the act of breathing created a situation where everybody was being exposed to lead, large amounts of lead. And we have data of that. I mean, we know what blood lead levels look like over time. And from the 1950s through the 1980s, essentially the whole population was excessively exposed to lead by any number that we look at now. And a person who did a lot of really good work on the topic was Herbert Needleman. And he was the person who looked at the relationship between the amount of lead in teeth as it influenced their skills within the classroom. So he looked at a number of different factors in the classroom, being able to pay attention, being able to, there are skills that are related to lead, behavioral issues, learning issues, that the higher the lead in the tooth, the worse the children are doing in classroom performance. And that certainly was a very important realization that the brain was being affected by the amount of lead that we were both breathing and that we were picking up from the soil. And the way soil works is that when the lead is accumulated in the soil and children then go outside and play in that soil, they're picking up hand to mouth. And also, as the summers progress, the soils become drier. And when the wind picks up the particles of lead in the soil, it goes back into the atmosphere. And that's been demonstrated in several cities across both the US and actually the UK has paid attention to that. So the atmosphere continues to get contaminated with lead particles, even though we've stopped putting lead into gasoline. It's such a large reservoir of lead that it ends up in the environment, and it's exposing people who are living in high traffic areas of historically high traffic areas.
It's such a compelling story because it's our children. Some of the symptoms of, kind of lead toxicity, behavioral and learning problems that you kind of mentioned, aggression, attention, slowed growth and development, hearing problems, seizures, even in severe cases. As some of the data is coming back to you and you're starting to put the pieces together, how do you start to get the story out?
Well, that's always been tough. And part of the problem is that the lead industry is not interested at all in hearing what this story is. They're not. They're paying attention to it to try to knock it down. And my issue is, of course, I don't have the kind of financial background, and I can't do the advertising, and I can't influence the federal government, CDC, or other health organizations about what we're finding about soils. And so um, it has been difficult in getting the message out. And part of the problem with getting the message out is that, okay, now I know this, what do we do about it? And so I've spent a great deal of time trying to figure out what to do about the amount of lead within an urban environment. And that took me to New Orleans to do that. I worked at both Xavier University, and of course now I'm an adjunct professor with Tulane University. But in the course of, I did the research on actually bringing clean soil into properties, mainly daycare centers, to change the amount of lead that is on the surface of the soil. Instead of digging out soil and shipping it someplace, uh, which is very expensive, we brought in clean soil from outside the city into the interior of the city. And it was relatively easy to do and had good results in terms of the amount of lead seen in the surface of the soil. Um, just I tried to get blood lead on the children at child care centers, but that program was uh, eliminated. I couldn't do it, and so we didn't get the full connection in that way, but we did get it in another way. So one study we did early on, actually in New Orleans, was at a child care center in which we measured the children's hand lead when they first came to school or came to the center and were playing inside. And then the children would go outside. And when they came back in, at the door, we measured their hand lead again. And what we discovered is that they had very small amounts of lead on their hands when they went out, but had very large amounts of lead on their hands when they came back in. So that connection became very clear that the reservoir of lead in the exterior environment, the outside environment, was much higher after they played in the soils than it was before they played in the soils.
There's something so grounding too, so to speak, about thinking the origin of this research coming from you and your students with your hands in the dirt in the gardens. It's very tactile and very real, and the idea that like this research that humbly begins in an academic setting goes on to reshape the entire automotive industry forever. At what point did you realize this work in soil wasn't just academic, but it was actually world changing?
That came up when I was in Minnesota. I had a lot of contacts in Minnesota. I'm from Minnesota originally, and I happened to live in a community that was academic community, and um, they that was the cornerstone of getting tremendous amount of information about lead and lead in the soil. Um, what we learned, formed a group called the Minnesota Lead Coalition, and as part of the coalition, we worked with the legislature of Minnesota, and we brought in people who had very strong connections to, for example, the petroleum industry. We had the people who were working at petroleum stations who were selling gas, and then they were also doing the muffler work that needed to be done about every 2 years back in the 70s and 80s. When you had a car and you ran it with leaded gasoline, the mufflers would burn out from the interior. And in working with the people from the Service Station Association, they had taken a lot of, they paid attention to what was taking place, and they started using unleaded gasoline, which was available in the, especially starting in the 1980s, and they noticed that their cars were running longer, and they realized that their industry had to change once lead was removed from gasoline, and they were willing to try to figure out what else to do with the service station besides having bays where they did a combination of both engine work to clean out the caked lead particles on valves. They called them valve jobs. And that was really important back in the 1960s, 70s when we were using leaded gasoline. And you could run a car about 60,000 miles. You had to do that. Well, the service stations were involved in doing that. And they actually reported that they could take lead out of gasoline, that their cars were running longer. And then it became clear that the service station, the petroleum industry was involved, of course, and the automobile industry. And then the automobile industry, General Motors was selling, they had the patents on the leaded gasoline, the tetraethyl lead, and they were milking that as much as they could to profit. But eventually, they developed another method of running an engine without lead, and they developed the catalytic converter so that the exhaust would be cleaned up. And they had sort of an interesting combination taking place where the lead and when taking lead out of gasoline and changing the engine or the muffler system to catalytic converters basically meant that there was an entire change in the automobile industry. And they ultimately pushed catalytic converters. They were certainly making a lot more money on catalytic converters than they were making on tetraethyl lead. So you have to look back at what industry was doing versus the damage that was taking place from use of lead and gasoline to the population and to the environment.
Yeah. Well, and one thing we know about industry is they don't like to change their profit centers. So you're challenging very powerful industries with really uncomfortable truths, and I think that could be intimidating and scary. How did you find courage when you were kind of faced against giant organizations?
I'm interested in the idea of what it means to be a researcher, that as a researcher, well, I'll read the quote. I have to pick it up. The right to search for truth implies also a duty. One must never conceal any part of what one has recognized to be true. This is a quote from Albert Einstein. It's found at the National Academy of Sciences. And I certainly was fully engaged in trying to understand the truth, but then I had amazing experience of having a child that ended up getting lead poisoning. And that was a total surprise to me that this would happen. And my tools involve measuring the amount of lead in the soil. And so I followed her around and I discovered she was playing in a play area that was excessively contaminated with lead. And it wasn't too far from a freeway system. So it became clear that the lead, and I happened to know her blood lead levels because she had some health problems, which were probably related to lead. She ended up with amblyopia, and which is cross-eyed, and so they had to have an operation. And as part of the operation, they took blood samples, and I said, "Okay, I want blood lead on my child." And they said, "Oh, you don't need that. You're living in a part of the city where there's children don't get lead poisoning." Well, that turned out not to be true. And I'm sure that other children living in playing in the same environment also were picking up a lot of lead from the environment. Well, that suddenly translated into uh, having nightmares about all children getting exposed to lead. And that um, whole process ended up being connected with why we had the Lead Coalition that was formed in Minnesota, the Minnesota Lead Coalition, and the purpose was to get lead out of gasoline. But
Yeah.
my child was a beginning of realization that all children were getting exposed to lead, and we found that to be the case when the state was measuring the amount of blood lead and soil lead. They saw the same. The data showed the same thing.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that story about your daughter. I could see like how that would give you great amounts of courage, and I particularly like the quote you shared too from Einstein about truth. It's interesting that truth it can be a contagion because there's no denying the truth. It is self-evident, especially when you have such compelling data. And it sounds like there's a couple of things that are happening. On one side, you have a momentum of evidence that's building, and you also have new technologies. So unleaded gasolines are available. How did this begin to switch? Was this government policy? Was this something inside the automotive industry that started to enact some of these changes? What was kind of like the signal that things were going to change in the future?
The legislature of the state of Minnesota attempted to take lead out of gasoline. Basically, um, they put together a proposal to remove lead from gasoline in the state of Minnesota. Well, that was illegal according to the U.S. government. And at that point, um, I we were struggling trying to figure out how to move forward. And it turns out that the legislature realized that they had to uh, develop a uh, proposal that they could share or send to. It was basically um, providing um, a. Oh, I'm losing words. But we needed to get to Congress and the EPA, and they petitioned Congress and the EPA to get lead out of gasoline. And that took place in about April of 1984. And the petition then arrived, and by then, Congress actually started uh, changing the rules of the uh, lead, uh, basically the Clean Air Act, to reduce and actually eliminate lead in gasoline. And then we had the hearing in June of 1984, and I testified at the hearing. And in the testimony, I certainly included my daughter exposure. I talked about lead accumulating in soils in cities. And my last statement was that uh, the, the House of Representatives had already voted to get lead out of gasoline. The Senate was holding it up. The House of Representatives, it turned out to be different parties. And at that time, suddenly both parties became involved and realized they had to get lead out of gasoline. So 1984 was the hearing. Within the next 2 years, by the end of 1986, 90% of the leaded gasoline had been removed. Then it took 10 years for the medical community to discover the changes that had taken place in blood lead. And they were always using blood lead to measure the amount of lead and it turns out we were using blood lead to find out how much lead was in the environment. And I kept saying that all you have to do is measure the amount of lead in the environment, and you can come up with a pretty good understanding of what kind of exposure was taking place from the environment. But that fundamentally was what took place, was the Senate hearing and a number of different people testifying, both the industry and it was an amazing experience.
Yeah. Just truly inspirational, that I think a lot of times people feel a little bit helpless, like they can't change anything, like they don't have the agency, but the arc and speed at which this happened is just absolutely incredible. And I feel like I just, I could speak for all of us to just say thank you, for really pushing that through and for the work that you did for your children and your daughter, is influential on my children and my daughter. Now as you're looking into the future with grandchildren, are there new environmental risks that concern you?
Unfortunately, um, we have a lot of new materials that are going into the environment that we don't really understand yet. Um, the environmental insult includes, even fluorides in water turn out to be the fluorides during pregnancy, children getting exposed to fluoride very early in life. It causes problems, damage to their nervous system. And that work has been conducted uh, around the world, actually. The Canadians had some good studies. Chinese did a lot of studies on that topic. And fluorides, we, we have a lot, we're exposed to a lot of fluorides. If you have
Yeah.
fluoride in the water, it's fluoride everything that is, you boil water, put something in, well, the food picks up the fluoride. Well, there are many other substances that are
Yeah.
of environmental concern and health concern in the environment.
You know, sure. It seems like in our times now that like, even scientific consensus isn't enough to move political will now. If you had a message for people of like just the scientific community at large, what would you tell them?
We are, we're in an age, one of the problems that we face in our culture is that it isn't against the law to tell lies. And industry is very good at figuring out how to take uh, and wrap things around a lie that then is uh, put into the environment or into our just regular. When you hear something being advertised, you don't know for sure what the truth is behind it, and
Yeah.
that's a major problem. So as a scientist, we clearly have to uh, move forward to uh, uh, interest people in the truth and to try to figure out ways to make the truth a and a very carefully uh, designed studies. You're also trying to understand how that study, what the consequences are of the material you're working with. In toxicology, that's always been a problem to uh, sort out uh, both the effect that the substance has and also uh, what the consequences are of using it in the whole population. And I think that
Yeah.
the good example is putting fluoride into water. Well, it's one dose for everybody, but children are much more sensitive and they drink more water for their body weight and they get much more fluoride into their system than an adult would. And you can't just use one dose. I mean, pharmacology becomes a very important issue. And
So,
so anyway,
yeah.
that's a great question. What do we do in science? How do we encourage science? We certainly don't underfund science, and we're doing that.
Yeah.
And
Maybe a more specific question about perhaps a young scientist, a young researcher that really wants to create a similar impact. They want to do something challenging and impact the world in a positive way. The Einstein quote really sounds like a mission statement and a call to action. How would you encourage a young researcher to follow his gut and get out there and challenge the status quo?
they certainly you, you have to capture the interest of people into different topics and so material that they would be that they'd like to study, and then they become involved with the studies. And I've always been watching nature programs, and recently I saw good discussion about beaver. It turns out that the beavers were being slaughtered, and that had an enormous impact in the water flows throughout the U.S. And um, well, how did that interest develop among people? It was through early education, through bringing up the ideas about there are many different subjects that could be explored. And of course, now we're working with at a totally different level than, I grew up in a period where you were happy to work with whole animals, but now they're working with DNA at very small levels. And I have no idea how you know, but people are involved in that and making differences in um, uh, different uses of materials and understanding it. So it's very general, um,
Yeah.
but it's
Oddly enough, I've been reading a lot about beavers too. Did you know that the first self-made millionaire in America was a beaver pelt trader?
yep, yeah. And it became so widely done that we almost wiped out the beavers in the United States, like we wiped out, almost wiped out the buffalo, the bison,
The buffalo.
American bison.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I was fascinated to learn that, largely because I was going to buy a black cowboy hat. I live in Colorado. It's no big deal. I've had a million of them, but I didn't really understand that, beaver felt is, the ideal, felt for hat construction. And of course, you see the old pictures in the Old West, everyone's got hats. So it's fascinating. So I was like looking for a cowboy hat. I found myself researching beaver populations through the the West.
it's amazing. And some states say they've never had beavers. And then finally the researchers started, yeah, there were beavers here. It just,
Yeah,
the indigenous population knew about the beavers. We've got to pay attention to what took place before we wiped out so much. And of course, that goes back to the lead industry because all of the bullets come from the mines of, and the mining industry always had tremendous support from the government because these are strategic metals. They're used in uh, warfare, and so it's becomes a really big uh, agglomeration of a lot of different connections between,
yeah,
and the connections are often surprising to see. Shooting,
absolutely.
um, when it comes to the lead industry and making bullets, well, one of the big problems we have is contaminated meat from shooters. And if you start paying attention to contaminated meat, you discover that that's being encouraged by the federal government, paying people to um, go hunting and then take the meat off to food banks and to other distributors of that meat, and it's often contaminated meat. And
Yeah.
we're not even looking at lead contamination of meat ordinarily. The state of Minnesota does, and there are a few other places, but it's it's a widespread problem.
Yeah, anecdotally, I lived next to a beautiful lake called Sloan's Lake in Denver, in North Denver. And, one thing they were really careful of is they didn't want people dredging up the bottom of the lake or, don't consume the fish from the lake. Unfortunately, because for about 60 years, they had a skeet shoot spot right there where you used to be able to go in the middle of the city and, shoot clay pigeons, So as a result, there's like thousands of pounds of lead buckshot in there.
Yeah,
And so by now it's been kind of covered over as you were kind of describing, and they don't want it disturbed. So yeah, I mean, the issue persists on. Professor Mielke, we're at that time in the podcast where we're gonna enter the lightning round. Are you ready for the lightning round?
I'm ready. We'll see what happens.
All right. What's been more important to you in your life and career, patience or persistence?
Persistence, I mean, is certainly both of them are important. I mean, you have to be patient through the periods of time when you're getting all sorts of negative um, comments back, and then you have to be persistent to move through that. So I see them um, equivalent in many ways. Um, that, but persistence, sort of covers the whole thing. And
You bet. How about inspiration or information?
you need inspiration. You have to, really be inspired to dig into the information. So, and again, the two sort of wind together. I was inspired as a result of what I was learning, and what I was learning moved me further along to try to get the information together.
How about mentorship or self-directed discovery?
Most of my discovery was self-directed. I wasn't getting a lot of support from mentors, although there were occasional mentor that was really important. At the University of Michigan, when I was studying um, the environment at that time, I had very little in way of tools. My professors continued to encourage me as I was working around a city, a small city, really a town, that had a lead smelter in the middle of it. Wasn't a lead smelter, it was a cement plant in the middle of the city. And I studied the people around the city, and I started realizing the connections between the environment and the exposures that people were taking place depending on the wind flow and things. And so I did, I had good mentors at that point, and that encouraged me to go on, and a lot of it was self. Uh, uh, I kind of worked through problems, and one problem would lead to another problem, and that would lead to another, and the answers to all of them were always important.
Yeah. One thing that I loved learning about is, you volunteered as a young man in the Peace Corps in Malawi. If you had a time machine, you could go back and talk to that young man. What would you tell him?
Oh man, um, I became really inspired in teaching in the education system, and just to stick with it, um, it, it's and I do that's what I did. I mean, I went from teaching in Malawi to teaching in Greece to getting a PhD, which led me to UCLA And then I just followed the path that was available to me at the time. And so that's, you just, um, you have to have courage to move forward in life. If you have an idea that you want to follow through with, it's going to take effort on your part. And
Yeah.
if you have an idea that's a reasonable idea, other people start realizing that, yeah, you have something to contribute. You know, you get other opportunities along the way.
If you could meet one person, living or past, who would it be?
The past, well, probably Claire Patterson. I have been on a radio broadcast with him at one point, but we never really met in person. And I always admire his work as a scientist. And he was a geochemist and did some amazing things. And
Yeah.
I knew Needleman, Herbert Needleman, and we were always in conflict because he always said it was a paint problem, and I always said, well, you have to look beyond paint. There's a lot of lead in the environment. But finally, we had a meeting at a lunch where we came together and realized, yeah, we were talking about lead exposure from in different pathways. And so those are, two very important people.
If you could start your career over again, would you do anything differently?
I can't predict what would happen if I started over again. It's certainly a different age now than when I was doing the work. My skills were more in the touching the soil and working in the laboratory with something that I could see, or more or less. Actually, the lead particles are invisible that you don't see. And that's what I was then trying to measure. But I would think that in today's age, you would learn very quickly that there's some amazing instrumentation available to do research of, different types of research that
Yeah.
would move you along pretty quickly.
When you think about your career as a whole, your personal life, what are some important lessons that stand out that you learned?
I've been fortunate, and I certainly had amazing people around me to be grateful for the life you have and to do what you can to maintain a gratitude and to then look for a future that expresses that gratitude. And I've been very fortunate in having, when I was doing the work, I didn't think anything was going to come out of it. I was really discouraged when I left the Senate hearing that I felt I was just not getting the message across. But it turns out I was getting the message across, and people did pay attention. And you just, that was a spark that has provided the kind of inspiration necessary to move forward. And don't worry about material things particularly. I certainly came from a family that was, not, they weren't poor, and so I'm privileged in that way. But I kept using my resources towards the end goal of of changing the environment. And when I found out, for example, I had a grant proposal that was eliminated, I mortgaged my house in order to get the funds necessary to pay the people I was working with to move forward. And don't be afraid of doing that. They're amazing outcomes. It resulted in one of our best publications in the National Academy of Sciences. And if I hadn't gotten the mortgage from the house, that wouldn't have happened. And so sometimes in retrospect, at the time, I was thinking, oh my gosh, I'm giving away all my resources, but it turns out I got tremendous return on it.
Love it. Burn the boats, Wrapping up here a little bit, how have you benefited from the products and services of Marquis Who's Who?
Well, Marquis Who's, I don't get, I don't get awards for a lot of the work I've done. In fact, it isn't even known. And so, Who's Who ended up being an amazing group of people who paid attention to what I was saying, and then awarded me in a way that I just don't get awards. So I appreciate that, and I have enormous gratitude for the care and the nurturing of a project that I've been involved in that I didn't expect to get any kind of reward for. So that's Who's Who has been great.
Awesome. Well, Professor Mielke, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for sharing your story with us. What's the best place people can connect with you online?
I keep looking at my email right now, and I have 460,000 messages. They go, no, I don't know what to do with that. And anything that somebody would provide via email, I might miss it entirely. I mean, it's just really difficult. And I haven't figured out. I'm not good at figuring out how to sort out the computer and the messaging. It's overwhelmed by so many ads and things that
Oh yeah,
I'm not very good.
we can all relate to
Your
that.
question, I am working on a book right now with a colleague, and that would be one way that people could find out something about what I've done and what it has generated into. I mean, I had no idea that my little presentation at a hearing before the Senate would end up resulting in a worldwide reduction in the amount of lead in gasoline. But nobody knows how it started. And who's helping me get that message out. And I really appreciate that.
Incredible. I know I connected with you on LinkedIn. That might be a better spot. My inbox looks similar, so email is definitely not the spot. We will link to your LinkedIn profile where people can connect with you. Professor Mielke, thanks again so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you, Ryan. This was a good session. Appreciate it.